Why, hello there, my lovelies. So, aside from being creepy, let me get this off my chest. I don't know how, after a clear and careful count, the election will turn out. We'll see. But regardless, it is uncanny the amount of minorities that I give rides to that openly express their support either of President Trump, or even if they don't explicitly say it, openly express voluntarily without me pushing it. I don't push this kind of stuff because I don't want a bad rating as a rideshare driver. But even if they don't explicitly express support for President Trump, they will instigate discussion of controversial issues. And even with my remaining neutral, eventually their views come out as being more libertarian in their view, and without using that word. But for example, complaining about race baiting, saying, giving criticism of the BLM movement, not the concept of Black Lives Matter. That goes without saying, Black Lives Matter. But expressing all these frustrations and views regarding taxpayers and welfare. It's just been so many. I have to say this. For all of the past year, I have had more people express such views who are minorities, even while I was driving in Baltimore. It's just uncanny. I did not grow up in an African American family, but I did grow up as a racial minority in a predominantly African American neighborhood. I spent my life in the Middle East as a racial minority and as an immigrant. And even more recently, I've lived in areas where I am a racial minority, and driving around for Uber, I have a disproportionate amount of conversations with people who are racial minorities. In the Baltimore area, almost exclusively African American, and down here, more in the DC area, it's about half and half African American and different types of Latinos or Middle Easterners. But to say that just because I'm white, because I've heard people say this before and it's very offensive, it would make sense to say that because I'm white, I don't know what people's views are, or I can't give any kind of testimony about it because I'm white. That could kind of make sense if I were a white person who grew up in a predominantly white area with predominantly white friends and spent no significant amount of time among minorities, on a national level minorities. But to say that to someone who you don't even know, you don't know what their experience is ridiculous and itself a prejudicial statement. It's like telling someone who happens to be African American but has spent his whole life around white people and never really hung out around other black people. It's as if to say that he doesn't know anything about what most white people think because he's black. That's ridiculous in itself as a racist statement. I have far more experience, friendships included, and I'm not talking about token friendships. I have far more experience in my life with different minority groups, as individuals, of course, than I have with white people. I only know one white person who is my friend, and that person is Jewish, a convert to Judaism. So aside from my immediate family members, who sadly I don't really talk to that much, I don't have the assumed experience of a white person. And to discount my views or my impression regarding the opinions of African Americans just because I'm white is BS. Yes, I didn't grow up in an African American home, but I was the only white person in my class. First grade, second grade, and third grade, until I was able to go into a private school with a rural private school, thanks to the very hard work of my, at the time, very poor parents, mom and stepfather, who adopted me as his own and worked very hard to provide an education for me. But both my formative years, I was the only white kid in the class. And then in high school, I was in a minority, as a racial minority, white person in a high school that was overwhelmingly African American. And in the Middle East and here, Baltimore is overwhelmingly African American. To say that I can't give any testimony to my impression of them is itself a bigoted statement. When I say my impression of things, I'm not saying this as an absolute fact, but in my experience, Joe Biden is full of crap when he said his racist statement that unlike Latinos, who are a very diverse group of people, African Americans aren't that diverse. In my experience, yes, I know from polls that African Americans in the United States predominantly vote Democrat, but that doesn't mean they all think the same. Even those who vote Democrat don't all think the same. There is a substantial percentage of African Americans who vote Democrat based on how their parents voted and based on their fear of racism, because they get these promises or they believe these narratives regarding racism. But that doesn't mean they are voting Democrat because they agree with all the policies in the Democrat platform. It doesn't mean that they endorse same-sex marriage. It doesn't mean that they endorse public debauchery or near pornography and pop music videos. And yeah, obviously some do. Obviously. But there's a substantial portion of African Americans who go to church. And there is, according to surveys taken, there is an overwhelming majority of African Americans, even if they're voting Democrat, that oppose defunding the police. And in my experience as an Uber driver, it's just ridiculous. The day after day, I have them expressing support either for President Trump explicitly or expressing opinions otherwise, other political opinions that pretty much align with libertarians and conservatives. I don't try to force it out of them, any of these opinions, so sometimes I don't hear it explicitly. But I'm not an idiot, and neither are they. Anyway, just wanted to get that off my chest. Because, I mean, I've had these experiences multiple times, and more recently this week, which is why I'm making this video. I've had it in the last 4 days in a row. It's just ridiculous. And I'm even getting it not just from African Americans who have a more standardized English, but I've also heard it from African Americans who have the more urban type of English. So it's not just those that have been around white people enough that they pick up this more standardized Anglo English. I'm even hearing it from people with the more inner city type, Ebonics type English. So yeah, the African American community is far more diverse than Joe Biden and the Democrat Party want it to be. What an insult and bigoted statement to say. And considering that President Trump got the highest percentage of minority support vote, what was it, since 1960 for a Republican, even if it turns out that he didn't win, the Democrat Party would be foolish to continue in its path of extremism and giving strength to radical politicians. I'm not against there being separate, different parties. I would love there to be more than just two dominant parties. But we can't have radicalism, people who want to polarize the nation in extreme ways, and then point to the speck in other people's eyes when they're ignoring the massive log, red cedar, or whatever those big trees are in, I forget, redwood, ignoring the redwood in their own eye. It's freaking absurd. And no, I'm not talking about each and every Democrat voter. I'm talking about the extremists who are the voice of the Democrat Party currently, unfortunately. So if you can reclaim your party and vote in more moderate Democrats, more power to you. But yes, the African American community is not owned by Democrats, and they're not owned by Republicans. They can think for themselves. We should stop viewing people, stop saying that we're against racism, but yet wanting wanting that an entire group will act a certain way. It's not true for gay people, not true for blacks, not true for Latinos, for Jews. It's not true for anybody. And to do the same thing about white people is the epitome of stupidity, considering that there would essentially, the Democrat Party would be powerless without a massive amount of white people voting for them as well. So it's just stupid. Let's cut with the BS, people. Make America great again. Yeah. Yalla bye.